So obviously you know where you are by the slide here. We're going to be talking about React and Storybook, and then all of these other things, which I'm not going to read. You know where you are. All right, so introductions. My name is Evan Wilhite. I'm a senior front-end engineer at Four Kitchens.
My name is Patrick Coffey. I'm a senior JavaScript engineer at Four Kitchens.
And for some reason, we separate those two things.
Yeah, I don't know why.
Yeah.
We're just engineers.
Yeah. So other information, Four Kitchens is kind of spread out all over the place. We're a distributed company. So I'm based, in theory, out of Nashville. I live out in the country in the middle of nowhere, but near Nashville, Tennessee. Patrick's based out of Austin. And then there's some other information about us that's maybe important to you, maybe not. But there you go. Well, these slides will be available. So. All right, so let's start with Storybook. We're going to talk about, let's talk about what we're going to go through today and what we just won't have time to go through. There's a few things that we're not going to cover that I want you to come up and ask us questions if you have questions about those things. So what I will be talking through first is Storybook, the component structure that we use within our Storybook instance specifically, including a little bit about atomic design within that, and then the Storybook Addon community, that plugin ecosystem, as well as some accessibility tools. And then Patrick is going to be talking through testing with Jest, snapshots, and Enzyme, and then how we use this entire workflow to build a new front end for PRI.org. So the sort of meat of what we did on that project itself. What I'm going to be talking through, I'm going to keep it much more generic than PRI.org, and so in theory you could run through the steps that I'm going to be talking through with Storybook on any kind of instance, as you'll see. So yeah, obviously storybook.js.org. If you don't have a hotspot, good luck, but there's the URL. You're probably familiar with it if you're in this session, but Storybook is an open source UI development library. That's their term for what they call this. And I think the reason for that is this list right here. And it's kind of lives in that strange place. Are you a pattern library? Are you a style guide? It's kind of weird language. So they use that term UI development library. And basically it covers this. It's a component library. In terms of the languages that it supports, those are listed there. We're going to be talking specifically about React. There's actually a lot of things that you can do with it. This is not an exhaustive list, but viewing and seeing components in different states. There is a robust add-on ecosystem that's kind of blessed by the Storybook people and also just out open in the community. So there's a lot of add-ons out there. We'll talk through a few of those later. And then you have some kind of development niceties like live reloading. You also have some kind of nice things in terms of sharing URLs with clients, kind of things you're used to probably with a development or pattern library. But Storybook does some of those really nice. And then it's open source and it's well backed and supported. Again, we'll post these slides, but there's some links there for you too. So let's talk about usage. We're going to go from installation to usage, and then I'll end with a running Storybook instance that's really bare bones. We'll talk about the PRI one later, but this is what I wanted to show is kind of how to get up and running with Storybook on anything, and what I used for my instance that I'll demo here in a second. Oh, actually, I won't demo it. This is your computer.
You can just swap it out.
If we have time, I'll show you. I just did it on a Create React app instance, so the instructions that I'm going to give you can do on anything. It's not just specifically with the tool set that we use on PRI. So installation, if you go to storybook.js.org, if you read their installation instructions, there's kind of a general set of instructions that you can follow. We're actually going to be talking through the specific ones for React, so those are a little bit different. This is the installation process for the Storybook React version. And then these, if you use Create React App, I'm pretty sure you don't even have to do these. I'm pretty sure they ship with that. But if you are using kind of a vanilla install, then you'll need to install React DOM and then Babel core. In terms of just adding it into your workflow, this is just a line from package.json where you can tell Storybook to run. This right here is this is the default instructions from storybook.js.org. And that's just basically like yarn storybook or npm storybook to run it. We use start on our instance. As you'll see, we kind of separated for PRI. We had our component library as one kind of repo and thing, and then we had the next-based app as a separate repo, and so we used start just because it's the common parlance for starting an application in our instance. In terms of the usage, as far as directory structure and files, in the application there is a .storybook directory that includes all of the configuration for Storybook. The Storybook configuration itself is in that config.js file, which we'll talk about in a second. But it's also the place where you put configuration for your Webpack installation. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of how you use Webpack with Storybook. Also, if you want to do any specific Babel configuration, the Babel configuration files go in there, TypeScript as well. And then there's some other things that go in there. Again, this is all on storybook.js.org if you go and look in their documentation. And then the add-ons piece also goes in this directory. So think of this as your configuration directory for all of Storybook, and it's kind of nicely tucked away. So in terms of what we need for Storybook core, like I said, we're going to be talking about this specific file, which is the config.js file. And the contents of that, this is actually the default content from their documentation. And so it just configures imports Storybook and then runs this function to require all of whatever files you want. So you could put whatever files you want in there. Your Storybook instance would pull those in. In our situation, yeah, there we go. In our situation, what we used on PRI was a little bit different. And I'll show you why in a second, but basically we wanted multiple directories, and we wanted to store sort of the exporting of those components in that directory itself. Instead of just having like one file full of like all of our components, you can imagine as it would grow, that would get like kind of unwieldy. So what we used on PRI, basically just to go through this real quick, it allows you to, what we did was we go through the components directory, which I'll show you here in a second in terms of organization. We're saying go ahead and loop through any subdirectories, and then anything that follows that convention of...
It's recording.
Okay. Yeah. Story.js, any file that ends with .story.js will get imported. So that was what we used specifically. I can skip one. All right, so let's talk about organization real quick. So in terms of organization, we've talked about the .storybook directory. Now we're getting down into where we actually house our components. So where we put the components. I'm going to be speaking specifically through Atomic Design. This is getting in a little bit into what we did on PRI.org, but please know that Storybook could care less how you organize your components. That's just one way of doing it. And it literally doesn't have anything to do with Atomic Design. We just applied that component directory structure to our project. So if that's something that interests you, know that you can do that, but you can in terms of what you do in terms of directory structure in the components folder, you can do whatever you want. So digging down into that, you can see we have the specific components within that, so a button component, and then if you're used to seeing that language, like molecules, the components are getting a little bit more complex, and then organisms, so on and so forth. Hopefully that's pretty self-explanatory there. In terms of adding components, this is what I was referring to earlier. Instead of just pulling in a single file where we house all of our components that's kind of in a root directory, we kept ours in, so if you'll look in for example here, Addons/Addons.story.js. So again, that allows us to keep just exporting the Addons components in a single file. That function that I showed you earlier loops through those and makes sure Storybook pulls all of those in. But it kind of keeps everything a little bit cleaner in terms of directory structure. And then this is what one of those files actually looks like. This is obviously a really simplified version, but importing React, importing the actual components, Actually, I'll show you that breakdown. Importing React and Storybook, importing the components, and then adding the stories. The syntax that you see there for the stories is the exact syntax you would use for adding stories into Storybook. And you'll notice that it has a directory structure, so stories of, so we're saying Atom/buttons. That's telling it where it's going to go in Storybook, what the actual, clickable thing that you're going to read on the front end is going to say. And then also it's adding one plain link. So as you'll see in the instance, you can add multiple instances of a component, and that's how you do that. There's a lot more that can go into this file in terms of the add-ons and how you tweak these components, but this is the simple way to get started. So yeah, in terms of add-ons, let's talk through that a little bit. Look at the time. So in terms of add-ons, that URL right there is for the sort of blessed add-ons that are available within the Storybook community. Like I said, there's actually other add-ons outside of that. I'm pretty sure actually the accessibility one is not on that list, if I remember right. There's a lot of really good add-ons that fall on that page and some that don't. So just kind of search around and see if you have what you need or something that you're interested in for a project. But a few that are, I would say, probably the most important in terms of just usage actions. So you can inspect component events right there within the pattern or within the Storybook component library, and you can demo those for clients. So changing component state and things like that. Linking pages together, you can make, one of the nice things that Storybook has is the ability to toggle between a full screen instance, and you can actually share that URL, so you can send literally like a basic online comp. And so for our demos with PRI, we would actually demo entire pages, and then if you were doing that for full projects, you could actually link those pages together and demo full sort of websites with mock data or with real data. It's pretty robust. Knobs, you can, there's kind of this nice one that you can like tweak props dynamically in there using like sliders and things like that. And then there's notes and info. There's actually a few things in this kind of camp that allow you to put a lot of extra information into Storybook. I wouldn't say that Storybook plays really well as a like a branding style guide or anything like that. But this allows it to kind of get there. So if you have notes for clients or if you have notes for other team members, there are add-ons to specifically house that information in a nice way. And then of course the accessibility one we'll talk through here in a second. And then I've added a giant list of other ones that I don't think we use any of these on our project, but they're interesting. They piqued my interest for future usage, and that's not an exhaustive list. There's a lot out there. In terms of adding actual add-ons into your project, it's just a matter of installing those per the instructions for each add-on, which is usually just an npm install. And then let's talk specifically about the accessibility one. Oh, I was going to show a demo.
Yeah. You can switch it out if you want.
Okay. All right, so this is the Create React App instance. Let me see if I can make that bigger here. Oh, this is just terrible. Do I have another option? I don't know whose that is. It's Yeti. It'll be fine. Can you guys see that okay?
No. Control-Shift+. Yeah, there you go. There you go.
All right. So let's go ahead, and this is already running. So this is the Storybook instance that I set up is just a Create React App instance. You can tell it's very bare bones. A couple of things I was going to show you real quick in terms of the keyboard shortcuts. And there's a little handy tool to see those. So if you needed to demo, like a full screen version, it's Command-Shift-F, and I won't go through all those, but again, that like appends itself into the URL so you can share that with the client if you need to, or the development team. And then there's these panels down here, and that's kind of where all of the add-ons go. So in terms of the accessibility testing or notes and info and that sort of thing. Let me see if I can. That's about the same. Is that very readable? Yeah. Okay, so hopefully you can see the directory structure that we talked about. There's this .storybook directory up here. We have our config.js file that we talked through, which will actually pull in the storybook components. I've already created an add-ons file here, but this is the file that you need to actually add these add-ons to your project. I'm just going to uncomment a couple of lines. Since we had to switch computers, I'm just going to go through both of these at the same time, and then we'll get on to the testing section. But the two that I added to this are the actions and then the accessibility one. And then I'm just importing those in my storybook file, this Addons.story.js, which is just one file that can be pulled in. And then there's a couple of things that I've added just from the instructions for each of those. The top one up there, the accessibility one, use something called decorators, which we don't have time to go into, but basically that's going to add accessibility testing to all the components. You can also just test individual ones if you want. And then the actions, this is just an extremely simple example of how actions get used. I may have to restart this.
I think refresh the page. There you go.
Yeah, so there we go. So you can see that in this panel section down here. There we go. That we have, so a couple of different components. We have an action logger and we have an accessibility tab. So if I click on that, you'll see that there's the button click event, and you can kind of inspect that right there within Storybook. That's the actions add-on. And then in terms of accessibility, it's going to tell you if there are any violations within your component. So I'll go over here real quick and let's see. Sorry, I'm having trouble reading that myself.
There you
go. Yeah. So you can see that got flagged just for like a color contrast difference. So we now have an accessibility error within here that we can work on. And so this is obviously this is not an exhaustive way of accomplishing an accessible website, but it's a very easy way to take care of kind of like low-lying problems. For us, it was a matter of maybe a few hours to fix literally all the accessibility issues on a home page, and that included the main menu that would drive the project. So it just helped us knock out sort of that easy, low-hanging fruit layer of accessibility issues. So yeah. All right, you ready?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. Oh, we can just keep going on this one.
Okay.
You got the slides up, right?
Oh, here, I'll let you go.
Cool. All right. I think we can make this work. I'm having a hard time because I can't see. Let me put it into presenter mode here. There we go. That's what we want. Okay, we'll just get back to the testing section here. Hey everybody, thanks for bearing with us on that. Okay. There we go. Now we're into testing. All right. I'm sure we all agree that testing your code is really important, right? I mean, it allows you to ensure that the things that you're doing in your components or in your code or whatever you're writing actually works as expected, and you try to cover it functionally, cover every branch, every line. And there are a lot of tools out there for doing this in JavaScript projects, and really in any project. Usually you have a standard testing suite. We've got a lot in the JavaScript world. We've got Mocha, Jasmine, AVA, Sign-On, all these tools that we can use to do different types of testing and to implement different testing approaches to really make sure that our code does the things that we think it's supposed to do. But there are some tools that you can use that will help you make your tests a little bit more thorough, that will simplify the actual syntax and the code you have to write to define your tests. And it will give you the ability to test not only how something renders or appears, but also how it deals with interactions, and you can sort of test every sort of level of what a component, be it a React component or some other component, or some other functional piece of code might do. There are some tools that really can actually just make your life easier in terms of being able to get to that 100% test coverage level. And the first tool we're going to talk about is Jest. I think Evan mentioned this previously. Jest's elevator pitch is that it is delightful JavaScript testing. The Jest team says that, and that's not hyperbole, actually. The Jest framework is a very, very robust, refreshingly simple, and easy to use platform, really, for being able to test. It has very robust assertion tools, assertion basically just allows you to set expectations for what certain lines of code, what certain mechanisms of code will be doing. It has a lot of matchers. Any comparison that you want to make in terms of what your code is outputting, you can basically expect that there's a matcher for that. So to be array containing, string matching, to equal, to be truthy, and probably 80 more. There's very easy function stubbing, very easy dependency mocking, and all this stuff is really nicely packed into React scripts, which is what's distributed in Create React App, which is the thing that was powering what Evan was just showing you. And it has like a really nice test runner, so you can run yarn test and get something that will watch your test files, allow you to run tests that follow a specific pattern. It does staged linting, or it's not staged. It measures the staged files in Git, and it will run the tests on components that have changed based off of that diff. And it's really easy to install. It's really easy to configure. So let's go ahead and take a look. Installation is pretty standard. You can just run npm install -d jest. If you're going to use React, you're probably going to be using Babel, so you're going to have to go ahead and install Babel Jest and Babel Core as well. And if you're going to use Babel 7, which is great and up and coming, you can run this specific installation command, which you can get off of the Babel Jest documentation. This basically just makes sure that you have Babel installed with the correct version and Babel Jest installed so that it can work with Babel, because there's a namespacing issue there. A little bit of weird stuff, but it works. If you're using Babel Jest, you'll want to make sure that you, of course, are configuring Babel, so you'll need a Babel RC file. But on top of that, you also need to tell Jest to use Babel Jest. And this basically is a property in your package.json file that allows you to instruct Jest to use Babel Jest to compile JS, JSX files. And that's what that basically does. So you will need that if you're going to test React components, probably. And just like Evan was creating start commands, we can create test commands. Two that I generally create. One is test, of course, and that just executes Jest. And I usually use the verbose flag because that will go ahead and spit out every single test and its results. And if you're logging things in your tests, or your tests are failing and have output, verbose will actually just put that out to the console so you can see exactly what's going on. So I just, by default, always include that. And then I create a test :coverage command, and that will run all the tests and generate coverage output so that you can inspect and see all the different lines that you have that are covered and the lines that you haven't covered, and see where you actually need to go in and adjust your tests so that they're more thorough, or add more tests to cover lines that haven't yet been covered. So just getting started, this is a very simple test. It's probably the simplest test you could imagine. We have a function by the name of sum that takes two variables, does no type checking, so it's not very good method, but it will take two properties and it will add them together. And then we have a test right below it that basically just passes it the number 1 and 2 and asserts that it will return the number 3. This test will pass, although we're not going to run it because this is just a picture of code. That's cool, but there's a ton of testing frameworks that can do this. I think everybody here is probably familiar with the syntax actually, because the syntax that Jest uses is actually directly pulled from Jasmine. So if you've used Jasmine before, you've done this before. So this is not really Jest's selling point, if you will. It could do some other really cool things, including snapshot testing. Now, snapshot tests are very useful tools because it allows you to make sure that your user interface does not change unexpectedly. It allows you to sort of basically define what you want your components to render, and then every time anything changes within the system, you can run your tests, and if the result is different, it will basically fail, and you can go and look at that failure and determine whether or not you want to update the definition of what that component should look like when it's rendered. And usually snapshot tests take a screenshot. They'll render an application's component or page or whatever it is you're trying to test, and they'll take an image screenshot, and then they'll compare it to a reference image that's stored, somewhere near the test, or something that you've defined as the canonical version of what that should look like. And it will do a diff between those two images and then return a result, and if the result is that it's different, the test will fail. And this is fine and maybe in some ways better than what Jest does, because if you have CSS that's modifying the visual definition of your components, that might not be in the component itself, it might be in some other file. So if you're rendering that, and there's a difference caused by CSS, then it will definitely fail the test. Jest doesn't really do that, but Jest just basically takes the component, renders it, and then caches a snap file with the rendered version of the component, and it does a diff against the rendered, basically DOM, as opposed to images. So it's a lot quicker. The snap files are human readable, and so when you get that diff, you know exactly what changed and how. Yeah, it's a very fast process, and it's very easy to test components, but not just components. You can basically assert that like Redux reducers are producing expected output. You can do all sorts of things with this snapshot testing. So the first thing that we have to do is install the React test renderer. I think you guys are probably tired of seeing npm i-d, so I didn't add that step. But you will need to install that. And then you can write your snapshot test. Basically what you do is you write an expectation, so you assert that the renderer, you create a rendered version of the component, you call toJSON, which turns that rendered version to JSON, and then you call toMatchSnapshot, which is another matcher. And that will do two things. It will, if no snapshot exists for the test that you've defined, it will go ahead and generate that the first time it runs, and then the second time it runs, or in subsequent runs, it will compare the new rendered version of that component to the existing snap file that you have. In the case that it's different, the test will fail. And you have the opportunity to inspect that, see what has changed, and if you like what's changed and you expect that, and that's all good and fine, then you can just run Jest or yarn test-u, or basically pass the parameter -u to Jest, and it will go ahead and just rewrite that test for you, rewrite the snap for you. It's not going to write tests for you. One of these days, maybe Jest will write tests for you, but not today. But yeah, so basically with basically just this code, you can take any component, render it to a snap file, and have this test fail whenever that changes. This is incredibly important when you're managing large amounts of components, small or large, because you might make changes to things, and that might affect the way that that component renders or behaves, and you want to know about that, right? Because that's technically a regression, and regressions are things that we do not want. So Jest snapshots are a very fast way for you to basically have this very, I guess I would describe it as robust level of testing. You can cover a lot of lines, right? Because a lot of React components are just responsible for rendering output. So you can get to a lot of lines of coverage, and you can basically make sure that your UI is not changing unexpectedly with a couple of lines. So it's a very, very nice interface and abstraction for doing this. So when Jest runs, like I said, it creates that snap output, and that's basically what it is. You can read it. It's just HTML. And this is what it compares against when it runs those tests subsequently. So nothing too complex there. It's pretty simple. The other cool thing about Jest is that it's not a monolithic framework. It's not a huge pool of tools that are kind of put into one giant package and are complicated and messy. It's just a bunch of tiny little modules. So if you want to, you can pull the diffing algorithm and use it to do something completely unrelated to testing if you'd like. It's not a monolithic giant that tries to do everything. It's a ton of small pieces that are composed into one platform or command line interface tool, which kind of solves all the problems that you might need to solve for in a testing suite. But if you want to make something different and you don't need some of the things that it provides, you can go ahead and make your own version or pull in whatever you want, and you're good to go. There's a built-in approach to mocking imports, functions, stubbing things out. It's fully compatible with async await, promises if that's what you want to use. And there are tons of matchers like I described earlier. So really Jest is a very thorough, robust platform by which you can create tests and be able to make sure that your components are not going to do things that are unexpected. Another tool that we used in PRI and beyond is called Enzyme. It's a tool created by Airbnb, so thank you Airbnb. Good work on that. Basically this tool allows you to traverse and manipulate and simulate events on components that you want to test. You can test interactions, you can test to make sure that your event handlers are working and being called as expected, and you can test lifecycle behaviors to make sure that when components are in different states that they're doing the things that they ought to be doing. It also allows you to do shallow rendering, which saves you some time because it's a little bit quicker than doing a full render. But it also allows you to avoid indirectly asserting behaviors on the children of your components. So if you're testing a component and it has children and you're not concerned with those children, you can avoid rendering them at all whatsoever, and you can basically just simplify your tests and not have to try to work around anything that might be rendering as childs of your component. You can just test the event handlers on your component specifically. Enzyme is a very well-formed abstraction. It's got adapters for React and more, and it's coming out with more adapters, so it's not React-specific. You can use this to test different types of components in different libraries. It's really just a syntax and a language by which you can go about testing these interactions and so on and so forth. There's not much to say here in terms of installation. There you go. There's another npm i-g enzyme. Now you got it. And in terms of configuration, older versions of Jest needed a setup test file, which basically pulled in Enzyme's React adapter. But as of Jest 15, Jest does not actually auto-mock anything anymore. So as long as you just install Enzyme and Jest Babel, you can import Enzyme and use its tools without configuring it at all. So good news, everyone. So here's a very simple example of me using Enzyme. And what we're doing here is we're creating a test and asserting that basically when we call or when we simulate a click on this component, that it's going to call its click handler. So we create a fake click handler, that's the Jest function stubbing there, so jest.fm, and then we pass that to the component here. And then we basically mount that component in its rendered version. And we're doing a full mount here as opposed to a shallow mount, so you could do shallow. And then we use the wrapper .find, and we find the specific thing that it's rendering. We know there's an anchor in that component that's being rendered. And then we call simulate, and we simulate a click event on it. And then, using just expect, we assert that the onClick method has been called only one time. Not twice, not 0 times, just one time. And if this test passes, then we know that the click handler for this component is being executed as expected. If that changes, this test will fail and we'll be alerted to the fact that something has been broken and we have a regression. And so now we know that every time our buttons break, we're going to be notified of that. This Enzyme is a really nice interface around being able to test these interactions and events, and it's a really useful tool. A couple of other tools that we use in the PRI project that, or in basically all of our projects that really assist in helping us make sure that our code bases are very, very, not smelly. The code leak detection tools is what they call them. So we use commit linting. All of our commits are linted to make sure that they follow a standard format. And what that does is it allows us to generate automated releases with automated release notes. So we use Semantic release, and it will parse all of those different commits, and based off of the commit type, it will create a new point release or a major release or a minor release. And continuous integration basically automatically runs linters, tests, build steps, and deployment. And deployment basically says, okay, well, if we're merging from a development branch into a release branch, go ahead, figure out what version we need to update this to, publish it to GitHub, publish it to NPM, and all that stuff is automated. This is really great because it allows us to streamline the process of publishing these things. And if we have different packages that depend upon each other and we need to update those packages, it's great if we can just have them updated automatically and then run npm update and be good to go. It saves us a lot of time. We also use ESLint with the ESLint config Airbnb standards, prettier, lint staged, which basically allows us to run linters only on get staged files, which saves us time because we don't have to lint tons of files all at the same time. And we use Husky to manage our Git hooks. Let's see where you are on time. 10:50?
10:55, I think we have 10 minutes.
Okay, cool. All right, so now we're going to talk about PRI.org and how we use some of these tools to basically create a new platform for them that is API-driven and a new React-based front end for them. So a little bit of context, PRI has been on Drupal 7 for 5 years. They experienced immense unexpected growth when they moved to Drupal, and then offsite content traffic skyrocketed, so they needed to be able to distribute their content to multiple sources, and they basically needed a front end that could be managed more easily. After 5 years of this high levels of traffic and growing traffic had transpired. And so they kind of partnered with us to basically determine how they should go about doing this and how they could sort of start progressively working distributed architecture into their development workflow. So we kind of approached this with a couple of different options on the table. We said, okay, well, we can build an API, we can build a front end, and we can completely migrate to that pattern all at once, and that's going to take us quite a bit of time because we have to build an API, you have to build a front end, and that's a lot of work to do. So we kind of decided to not do that and to take a little bit more of a progressive approach and to migrate those different views and routes to a React-based front end, route by route or content type by content type. So the first thing that we sort of attacked was the home page. And this is what the old homepage looked like. It looked like this for probably 5 years. The small, slight updates here and there, but that's what it was. And our job was to replace that with a new front end that could be rendered with React and with these new modern front end JS tools. So the first task at hand was, of course, to build an API that could power the new front end and distribute content to these external resources, because those were the two major goals that they had. We used a RESTful module, a Drupal 7 module, to create the JSON API compliant API, and hat tip to Matteo for actually writing that module. It's really, really phenomenal. And if you're looking to build an API in Drupal 7, that's the place you got to go. So we built out CRUD endpoints for all content types and taxonomies, and exposed all the data that should have been exposed to any client that wanted to use that information. While the backend folks were busy working on the API, Evan was over here working on the component library. And the component library doesn't need an API to instruct it on the data that it needs to render or how it should render that data. It's a very, you don't really need data shapes to render isolated small components. And so basically we kind of had a little bit of a bonus there because we could work on the components that would eventually render the page and also the data that would power those components. Kind of at the same time, but not really in a related way. So once we had the API and once the component library was published to NPM and we were in a place where we were ready to use it, we went ahead and open sourced the component library and published it to NPM, basically we ended up with this. So what we did was we took the published component library, we took the API, we wrote an ingestion layer and a parsing layer to basically take the data and change it into shapes that were more compatible and consumable by the React components. We then used all those small isolated components to construct this page, and there you go. New home page. And it was significantly faster. It was a lot better in terms of its design, and PRI is now going through and working on building in this system and in using these patterns the rest of the site. And the next thing I think they're targeting is probably stories, so the article pages themselves will now be rendered in this view here pretty soon. Any questions?
When you were evaluating component libraries, what gave Storybook the edge over others?
So he asked, when we were evaluating component libraries, why do we choose Storybook? Honestly, I come from more the front-end side of Four Kitchens. We have kind of a dedicated JavaScript team, and that team had used Storybook on projects. I think they vetted it against, what is the other, React style guide or something like that. There's another project out there that's kind of popular in the React ecosystem, and they had nothing but positive things to say about Storybook. They had used it on maybe a couple of minor projects, but this was really the first time for us to kick the tires on it as like a legitimate thing that we would use in like our process with the client, getting approvals and things like that. And I come from using Pattern Lab on the PHP side with Drupal a lot, and it felt just as seamless or more seamless in terms of that process. Again, it doesn't get into the territory of like, it doesn't serve well as like a branding sort of high-level style guide for like content editors, things like that. That's both of neither Pattern Lab nor that do that well, but that was it wasn't a really sophisticated process, but I took their advice.
Yeah, I think the add-on structures that Storybook has are actually really kind of unique. It basically allows you to inject these new behaviors, but by default, it's really just very simple to get started with, and that was a really attractive thing to me, at least.
So, PRI adopts a Drupal 7 side, and you're progressively decoupling it by inserting these components into the Drupal theme. You're not serving this from Node.
That's a great question. So the question is, are we basically pulling these React components into Drupal in the theming layer, or so on and so forth? So the way that we actually chose to do this is we actually have Drupal still being the router and being responsible for determining what to render based off of the path that it's given. And then it's very simple right now. If somebody views the home page, it does a proxy out to the Node app where it grabs the rendered version of that content, pulls it in, and renders it. So
Drupal is calling the Node server, and then the Node server renders it, pushes it back to Drupal, Drupal serves it to the web.
That's correct, yes. Another way to handle that would be with the load balancer. So if you had a load balancer standing in front of Drupal, you could say, okay, for these paths, you just delegate that to the Node server and delegate these paths to the Drupal server. In our case, a proxy was the most appropriate way to handle that, but I think load balancers probably would be more robust and more scalable.
Yes, Salem?
Who's doing all your hosting with that Node servers?
We used the Zeitz now.sh servers. Kind of did some research, and it looked like they were very inexpensive, but also pretty robust in terms of their infrastructure. No complaints. Worked very, very well. Deployment was very easy. Zeit is doing some really great work.
Does this mean you guys are breaking it with Pattern Lab?
Say what now?
Does this mean you guys are breaking it with Pattern Lab?
He's asking if we're working with React and Pattern Lab. You wish. I thought you were solving that problem.
He was asking if we were breaking up with Pattern Lab.
Oh, we'll talk about that later.
I was curious, so when you sort of embarked on this and planning on breaking things into this atomic design pattern, how did you as a development team work together with people on the UX side to sort of determine that? I mean, you're not using this, again, as a guide for them, but it helps them presumably in the future. What was that interaction?
Let me speak to that. Okay. Yeah. I'm going to repeat this back for this, but also to make sure I understood you right. So basically, their process was they were determining UX, like PRI was designing in-house. We were taking that and implementing it. How was that back and forth?
Yeah, exactly. And in terms of breaking that into components, making sure it made sense and story.
Yeah. I will say we had a phenomenal relationship in that our contact who did design was also kind of like a
PO, yeah.
Yeah, like a project owner. And so he was also a developer by background. He understood development practices. And so he was, from the get-go, he was excited about the process of us taking the design seriously, but also doing the same thing on the development side to where we could get like not only sign off more quickly on individual components, but like also break those things down for reusability. Because again, I don't know if you caught this in his explanation, but PRI is actually working on implementing what we've built. We aren't working on that. And so there was this process of we were trying to set them up for success when we're out of the picture, to where they can actually implement what we've given them in this easy way. And part of doing that was a component library to say, just reuse as much as possible, don't recreate. He was extremely excited about the process. So it was very positive. I can see maybe where it could go badly, but I think if you have a designer who understands that process, and we walked through Storybook with him early on, and he understood pattern libraries. We were really just familiarizing him with that tool. So yeah, it was pretty seamless with that client specifically.
Yeah, there was some back and forth with them in terms of taking designs that they had created that were more complete and cohesive, and we kind of took that and broke that up into smaller pieces. And I think there was some back and forth on pieces that needed to change based off of the fact that we were taking a more component-driven approach. But that process was really, really seamless because the people that we were working with were very much looking to develop something that was robust and future-facing.
Yeah, and a great example is the accessibility. So we fixed all accessibility issues except for color, like contrast, and because that's really a design decision. And we passed that back and we said, these still exist. It's okay. It's not a big deal because it's up to him. And he just took it on himself. He was like, I'm going to fix every single one of these. And so he went through and kind of tweaked his. I mean, he had already set brand colors and everything, and he tweaked them so that all those would pass. So he was definitely invested.
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of related, but I noticed there's you listed a sketch plugin for Storybook. What does that do?
I would assume that it integrates with Sketch.
Because part of the process is designer is in Sketch, and our designers are doing components more or less in a similar manner to Storybook and Pattern Lab. What is that plugin doing, and how much of Sketch can we seamlessly integrate? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head. It's been a while since I looked at what that add-on did. Asking about the Sketch add-on, but yeah, check it out. I'm sure it's exporting into Storybook or from Storybook, something like that.
It's got to be useful. It exists, right?
We got a couple more minutes. Do we have any more questions? Yes.
How do you manage URLs in your application? URL routine.
Oh, routing, yes. That's a great question. So he's asking how do we handle routing in the application. There's a couple of things that we did. So first off, Drupal was still the primary router, and it was responsible for making sure that if you visit the home page or any other page, it goes through and fetches the correct result, right? And then in the application that was running on Node and in the Node servers, we had a routing mechanism that kind of worked in the same way. It can accept routes and it can return different components and structures and layouts based off of what route it receives. The API is kind of like the glue between those two things, because what it allows you to do is take a URL and then request that Drupal send you a API response with the nodes that it would return from that URL, right? So you can basically filter by articles, for instance, and say, okay, give me an article that has this specific URL or this redirect URL, and it will just kind of generate that for you and return it. And that was very, very useful because that allowed us to basically just integrate that filter query into our resources and then be kind of pretty much done there.
So the contributors in Drupal can can create its own URL schema.
Mm-hmm.
The the application as Drupal, which is this URL, and then you decide which template you display on screen?
Yeah, no, basically you can create any URL you want in Drupal, and that basically instructs the API to return different nodes and different objects of data based off of what URL it has. So it's basically just kind of like a field, honestly, that you can filter by. Any other questions?
I think we might be out of time.
All right.
Thank you guys
Cool.
very much.
Thank you so much.